Or should I say rather, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are, from wherever you may be joining us. And I'd like to welcome you to the Making Black History Reflections on the United Nations International Decade of People of African Descent panel discussion session, presented by the English section of Amnesty International Canada. My name is Isan Gardi, and I serve as the Director of Mobilization and Communications here. First, I'd like to thank you for joining us for what we anticipate will be a highly thought-provoking and engaging conversation. Before I give a short land acknowledgement and introduce our host for the evening, I do have a few housekeeping notes. Firstly, you'll be happy to know that the panel discussion is being recorded. So if you are joining late or you have to step away for a bio break or what have you, you'll be able to watch it again in full later, and we'll be sending around the recording to all those who've registered, and you'll be able to watch it again. Just another housekeeping note: to enable closed captions, you'll first need to find the closed caption or live transcript icon in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. It's usually there. On some computers or mobile devices, you might need to press the More button. Then you click on the icon and select Show Captions and save English as the language. The live captions should show up on the bottom of your screen. If you can't find the caption option or you need additional support, please use the Q&A feature and one of our staff will support you. While I'm on the topic of the Q&A, I would respectfully request that you please submit any of your questions that you might have for any of our esteemed panelists using the Q&A function on your screens. Given our limited time together, these will be organized according to common themes that may come up and given to our host to present to our panelists. We apologize in advance if your question is not asked and hope that you'll understand. Finally, a link as well to the survey following this webinar will be sent out so that we can get your thoughts and feedback on today's panel discussion, and so that we can use that input as part of our own learning journey. Before I provide my land acknowledgement now, I'd like to quote some teachings provided by Native Land Digital that strives to create and foster conversations about the history of colonialism, Indigenous ways of knowing, and settler-Indigenous relations. It reads, "Territory acknowledgement is a way that people insert an awareness of Indigenous presence and land rights in everyday life. This is often done at the beginning of ceremonies, lectures, or any public event. It can be a subtle way to recognize the history of colonialism and a need for change in settler colonial societies. However, these acknowledgements can be easily a token gesture rather than a meaningful practice. All settlers, including recent arrivants, have a responsibility to consider what it means to acknowledge the history and legacy of colonialism. What are some of the privileges settlers enjoy today because of colonialism? How can individuals develop relationships with peoples whose territory they are living on in the contemporary Canadian geopolitical landscape? Where are you or your organization that you're with doing beyond, or what are you or your organization doing beyond acknowledging the territory where you live, work, or hold your events? What might you be doing that perpetuates settler colonial futurity rather than considering alternative ways forward for Canada? Do you have an understanding of the ongoing violence and the trauma that is part of the structure of colonialism? As Chelsea Vowell, a Métis woman from the Plains Cree speaking community of Lac Sainte Anne in Alberta, writes, "If we think of territorial acknowledgements as sites of potential disruption, they can be transformative acts that to some extent undo Indigenous erasure. I believe this is true as long as these acknowledgements discomfort both those speaking and hearing the words. The fact of Indigenous presence should force non-Indigenous peoples to confront their own place on these lands." So today I encourage all of us, regardless of our complex social locations, to not only consider the acknowledgement being put forward, but to also make clear our collective and individual responsibility to moving beyond acknowledgements to action that builds a decolonial future for all and that reduces the ongoing violence and trauma experienced by Indigenous peoples. So it is in that spirit that I acknowledge that I speak to you today as a settler, and where our headquarters of Amnesty International Canada English section are based in what is known today as Ottawa, which is on the unceded, unsurrendered traditional and ancestral territory and lands and waters of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. Their presence here dates back to time immemorial, and we respect and reaffirm the inherent treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across this land. Across Turtle Island, or what we now know as Canada, our team and panelists are joining us from other Indigenous treaty lands or unceded territories from which they have been dispossessed and denied their rights to self-determination. When our panelists introduce themselves, I also welcome you to share from which territory you're speaking. Now it is my pleasure to introduce you to our host for the evening and our moderator for this panel discussion, Amnesty International Canada English Section's Board Chair, Agapi Gesesi. Agapi is a dynamic and fearless changemaker with over a decade of experience in community development. With a master's degree in social justice, Agapi has dedicated her career to enhancing the lives of marginalized youth. Born and raised in Toronto by a refugee mother, her personal experiences have fueled her commitment to social change. As the executive director of the CEE Center for Young Black Professionals, Agapi has spearheaded substantial growth, expanding the organization's impact and sustainability. She's a passionate advocate for economic empowerment, diversity, and youth engagement, captivating audiences on local and national stages. Agapi's remarkable achievements have been recognized with numerous awards, including the Leadership Award at the BBPA Harry Jerome Awards and the YMCA Woman of the Year title. Her impactful work has earned her accolades as a dial mover in tech and the Maytree Fellow Award, showcasing her dedication to making a difference. With that, I pass it over to you, Agapi.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here today. It's a weekday and you really could be doing other things, but you're here with us celebrating Black History Month. So very excited for all of you to be here. I'm even more excited for you to hear from our panelists today. It's really an honor and a privilege for me to be able to serve as the board chair of Amnesty and the important work that we're doing at an international scale. And I'm so excited to hear from the amazing women that we're going to hear from today. So for those of you who are, have questions around the decade of people of African descent, I'll give you a little bit of a background on it. It's, like I said, my pleasure to have a conversation around the meaning and the impact of the International Decade of People of African Descent, which was decided on December 23rd in 2013 at the UN National Assembly. They proclaimed it the International Decade of People of African Descent, they decided that it would commence on January 1st, 2015, and that it would end on December 31st of 2024. So we are reaching the end. And this was after a working group of experts on people of African descent proposed that a global program of action be in effect for a decade. 5 years after it was declared in 2015, in 2018, the Canadian government formally endorsed the International Decade and commenced to act on issues affecting Black people in Canada. Some of these commitments included improving research and data collection, addressing mental health challenges, systemic discrimination, and overrepresentation of Black people in the criminal justice system. Canada recently announced that it will be extending the Decade of People of African Descent for 4 years. However, how much progress has been made so far? It has most recently reported that at the UN Global Assembly, the working group of experts on people of African descent observed that significant human rights abuses and violations, as well as a powerful global culture of denial prejudice, too often ignoring the systemic aspects of criminal discrimination, disparities, and injustice. How close or how far is Canada when it comes to realizing the rights of people of African descent? Today, we have the privilege of hearing from 3 very amazing panelists that I'm very excited to introduce to you. Our first panelist is Gaynell Curry, is a Bermudan human rights leader with nearly 25 years of experience working with the United Nations. Gaynell has served as the Gender and Human Rights Advisor for the Office of the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights in New York, and oversaw the office's efforts in support of International Decade of People of African Descent. In 2022, she has served as a member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, a platform for improving the safety, quality of life, and livelihoods of people of African descent. In addition to her work internationally, Gaynell has held important posts in Bermudan government, including as the Director of Gender and Family Affairs in the Department of Social Services and Urban Development. She is a member of the law faculty of the University of Bahamas, where she lectures on international human rights, law, and public international law. Secondly, we have Evelyn Myrie. Evelyn Myrie is a community activist, educator, and entrepreneur in Hamilton, Ontario, who has held many leadership roles in her public, nonprofit, and private sectors. Currently, she serves as the president of Hamilton Afro-Canadian Caribbean Association. She is the CEO of Empower Strategy Group, which helps people, workplaces, and community groups create inclusive, anti-racist organizations. After moving to Hamilton in 1989, Evelyn quickly emerged as a beacon of the community. In 1996, she co-founded the John C. Holland Award, honoring the contributions of Black Hamiltonians, if I got that right, to city's social, economic, and cultural life. Evelyn's equity work has earned her numerous awards in the city of Hamilton. She is the recipient of the Queen Elizabeth and the Second Gold and Diamond Jubilee Awards. Evelyn has been called an anti-discrimination trailblazer and is featured in 100 Accomplished Black Canadian Women, a book which celebrates achievements of Black women and their paths to success, just to name a few. And last, but certainly not least, is Floydine Charles Fardell. Floydine Charles Fardell is a change agent with more than 30 years experience improving the lives of people in Toronto. Now the executive director at the Caribbean African Canadian Social Services, Floydine is a founding member of the Taibu Community Health Center in Scarborough. She serves as a community-based research teams locally and nationally. More recently, she initiated Meetings of the Minds, a space where Black leaders to engage on high-level strategic discussions. This national initiative ultimately led to the creation of the Supporting Black Canadian Communities Initiative. And in 2021, announcements by the Canadian government of a new National Institute for People of African Descent. For her efforts, Floydine has been honored with multiple awards, including the prestigious Harry Jerome Award for Health Sciences, a City of Public Health Champion Award, and the United Way of Greater Toronto's Leadership Award, amongst many others. Please join me this evening in welcoming these very esteemed women to our panel. A warm welcome to our panelists. And I would like to just do a quick reminder. If you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can in the allotted time. So without further ado, let's get started with the questions. I'll have each of the panelists answer each of these questions before we move on to the next one. And so first, I'm going to start with you, Ms. Curry, to start us off with the first question. So explore and assess the progress made in addressing the full and equal participation of Black communities during this International Decade of People of African Descent, with a focus on achievements up to the present and potential future milestones now that Canada has extended its support to 2028. Are there any islands of excellence, also known as positive accomplishments, that might be highlighted for the audience?
Hello, everyone, and just would like to say um, a small correction. I'm actually from the Bahamas and not Bermuda, so I just wanted to say that so that we're all clear that I'm not misrepresenting Bermuda or the Bahamas.
Apologies, that is on me.
It's quite okay. It's quite okay. The beautiful bees from the Caribbean. That's okay. It's a pleasure to be here. So let me get started on the first question. I like to start with a small thought about where I am right at the moment. So paying homage to our ancestors throughout the Americas, thinking today of our journey and efforts to unify the diaspora, thinking today in particular of our Bahamian Haitian brothers, James Weldon Johnson and John Rosamond Johnson, writer and composer of the Black National Anthem. Lift up your voice and sing, thinking of their call for us Bahamians, Haitians, and other Blacks in this diaspora, to let our rejoicing rise, to sing a song full of the faith that the dark part has taught us, to sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us, facing the rising sun of our new day begun. We today will continue to march on until victory is won for all Black people in all parts of the world. Thanks again for having me. So since its implementation, positive movements toward the goals of the International Decade of People of African Descent have been made. Yes, there has been progress, particularly in increasing the international community's knowledge of, respect for, and the heritage, culture, and contribution of people of African descent to the development of societies here in the Americas and the world over. This positive movement, I have to say, jumping right into it, was spurred on by the unfortunate murder of George Floyd during this decade, which brought millions of people to the street around the world over this particular issue, chanting previously neglected reality that Black lives do in fact matter. So being a UN staff at the time, what was clear to me was how this shifted the discussion surrounding people of African descent in the Secretariat and in intergovernmental bodies such as the Human Rights Council. Although we had already been well into the decade, not much discussion was taking place at that time within the UN, not to the extent that we saw post George Floyd. So this incident, unfortunate incident of his killing, marked a great movement within the UN system toward the implementation of the decade. So it marked the establishment of the International Independent Expert Mechanism to advance racial justice and equality in terms of law enforcement. So specifically, the UN thought, what do we need to do? We need to jump in, the international community jump in and respond immediately to issues surrounding violence against people of African descent, discrimination of people of African descent in law enforcement. Secondly, and perhaps in my mind, most importantly, it led almost immediately to the setup of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, of which I'm proud to be a member. This, I think, has provided the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, which is a consultative mechanism on the human rights of and the safety and quality of life of people of African descent. But most importantly, in my mind, is this provides a platform for Black people, for people of African descent. In our most recent meeting in New York, we brought together over 1,000 civil society organizations and partners to speak to issues relevant to people of African descent. This type of voice has not been heard since 2001, this type of coming together at such a large number of people of African descent. 2001, at the time of the Durban Conference on Racism. And so it's a very exciting time for us. And we're proud to say this is happening during the decade. And so for us, the decade is not a loss. There's still an opportunity for us, even in the last few months of the decade, for us to celebrate, for us to rejoice that some progress has been made, and to think about what happens in our next decade. So we at the forum prioritize the decade. It is one of the 4 priority areas in our mandate, in fact, alongside the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, the Declaration on the Human Rights of People of African Descent, which we are actively, the forum is actively involved in currently elaborating. This Declaration on the Rights of People of African Descent will be an opportunity again for civil society and Black people the world over to contribute to what they see as priorities for themselves. They are to contribute to this declaration. It's not something that the UN and others are preparing for them, but that they are actually contributing to. And this is crucial to say. And our platform, the Permanent Forum, provides that civil society organizations and others, with our support, with our partnership, contribute directly to the Declaration on the Human Rights of People of African Descent. And our third issue alongside the decade is the issue of data and evidence-based research. We recognize that the invisibility of people of African descent is a concern, particularly women of African descent. They are not spoken of, they are not heard of, they are often not remembered at all, particularly in big frameworks such as the 2030 Agenda for People of African Descent. And when you're not mentioned, when you're not thought of, you're not planned for, you're not budgeted for. So for us in the forum, I want to say that our priorities, our first 2 sessions have focused on something that's very, very, very important to me, the issue of justice. I'm speaking of climate justice. Being a person from the Caribbean, this is very important to us because we want to be here in another 50 years. So we want these islands to be around, right? And for us to be living and our children to be living on these islands. So climate justice is important for us. What does this mean? It's very important for us to think about this when we think about justice in the context of people of African descent. These islands of the Caribbean are predominantly populated by people of African descent. We talk about economic justice. What is economic justice? You speak about climate justice. How can you not think about economic justice? We have to reinvent ourselves after every single hurricane, after every single earthquake, with the challenge of trying to get the funding internationally, which comes with lots of high interest rates, caveats, and so forth. So during this decade, we say we need to be thinking about economic justice. What does that mean for us? Perhaps we need to be thinking about a new economic system that responds to small island developing states like the Caribbean and other states that are developing. And lastly, we are thinking about reparatory justice. So it's climate justice, economic justice, and reparatory justice. For us, this is important. We cannot speak about another decade without speaking about justice, without speaking about reparations. And it ties into the ongoing theme of recognition, justice, and development. For us, the priority has to be justice. And it is being echoed in so many different areas these days. The UN 10-point, the CARICOM 10-point plan, for example, on reparations, highlight what we need. And since 2014, they've outlined why it is important for us to be speaking about reparations for people of African descent, and how should we be linking this specifically to issues around development, right? People often say you shouldn't be speaking about money. Well, I like to speak about money, that's fine, but let's speak about development. It's directly linked to development, right? The transatlantic slave trade, colonialism was about money, was about wealth generation, was about development of certain areas, certain countries in the world, not necessarily ours. So we have the CARICOM 10-point plan, and this is something we're going to be working to promote through the forum as well, and alongside partners in CARICOM. We also have more recently the European Parliament's 2019 resolution talking about meaningful redress and past injustices and crimes against humanity. There is this echo that's coming from various quarters. The African Commission also spoke about it recently in 2002 in a resolution. How can we conceptualize reparations from the African perspective, specifically looking at people of African descent in the diaspora? I would wrap up by saying this thing. The Permanent Forum is of the view that there can be no real development or justice without recognition and acknowledgement of the past injustices and concrete plans for reparations for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gaynell. That was from the Bahamas, to be clear, everyone.
From the Bahamas.
I think that you touched on a lot. I think we also sometimes don't recognize how when we talk about intersectionality, that when we're talking about justice, that all of these things are layered and they tie into each other. So I'm so glad that you touched on all of those pieces, and that they, you know, environmental justice means economic environmental fits into the reparations. It all works together. So thank you so
Yes.
much for touching on that. I'm gonna hand it over to Evelyn, the same question, and just to reiterate, you know, we're really wanting to focus on the achievements up until the present and the potential milestones for the future, and giving us your perspective and making sure that everyone knows that you are from Hamilton.
Yes, thank you so much for the kind introduction. And yes, I'm proud Hamiltonian, originally from Windsor via Jamaica. So I'm happy to be here. I just want to, as my sister Gaynell, acknowledge our ancestors, because we have to take a moment in every forum and platform we get to acknowledge those who have come before us, on whose shoulders we stand. So having a national space here, I thought would be really important to acknowledge some names that we need to keep in our minds. People like Howard McCurdy, one of the early MPs in Windsor, Ontario, who's made so much work to drive equity and anti-Black racism when it wasn't really that popular. The word was not even acknowledged or respected among us. Also, Rosemary Brown from Vancouver there, and Jean Augustine, who's with us still and continue to work forward on issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and women's equality. Floret Osborne was a constant voice at the UN for the Congress of Black Women. She's passed on the last 2 years. And Glenda Sims, who we just lost a year ago, was also a fighter for all of the rights for Black people in Canada, and a very strong voice at the UN. And, you know, historically, people like Marianne Chad, Nanny of the Maroons in Jamaica, and Yaa Santua of Ghana, who inspires me to keep going, notwithstanding the challenges. So to get to your question, within the context of Canada, Gaynell spoke much more around the global context and folks in the Caribbean and some of the areas at which she's working. I'd like to just focus my comments on Canada. I think some of the achievements so far has been the articulation of what many of us have been fighting for, to acknowledge the perniciousness of anti-Black racism and to actually name it, to name Afrophobia as a real issue in moving forward the agenda. We need to acknowledge that chattel slavery and its impact on our community and our society generations later. So one of the achievements has been, or continued to be, is to push forward the notion of addressing anti-Black racism. And I think the national government has acknowledged that anti-Black racism exists. And locally, in my local jurisdiction here in Hamilton, Ontario, the police services, who has been a big struggle to really address the issue of justice and policing and profiling, has acknowledged anti-Black racism. So there's a growing body of institutions who are actually acknowledging the reality of anti-Black racism and starting to put some efforts and some tactics and strategies to address it. In fact, the Ontario government recently announced that starting in 2025, the Black history will be included in the elementary curriculum, which is a really great move. It's a bit late, but you know what? It's better late than never. Those of us who've been fighting for those issues have certainly seen some changes happening. So that's one or two of the areas I think that we are seeing some changes in. The whole issue of hate crime and trying to address issues of evidence-based data to actually drive policy around hate crimes and so forth. Developing community capacity, you know, we have been seeing some changes and some improvements. Myself who work in the nonprofit sector, and I've been around for a good while now, and we're able to access more resources in Canada around projects or initiatives such as the supporting community, Black community initiatives. It's a really important project that has given support to Black communities and identifying Black intermediaries who are playing a role of decision maker, building their capacity to support Black communities. So those are some of the programs I noticed that has changed over the years. Whole issue of mental health. We know the Black Health Alliance in Canada has received some funding, and there's more acknowledgement. My goodness, we know that Black health has been a major concern. Mental health issues, we have been marginalized. When Black people go for Black children get in trouble at school, no one says, let's see the counselor. They said, let's call the police. That's, the school to prison pipeline that we've created in this country. We've had to attack it. It is not there yet at all. But the fact that there's an acknowledgement that there's mental health happens in the Black community as well. We are not simply troublemakers. There are people with mental health challenges, of course, and support for that. Also, the business, economic entrepreneurship programs that the federal government has rolled out. They do have their, need for improvements, but the fact that there's a rolling out of some programs, and someone like myself who've worked for government for 20 odd years, as a funder, I've never really witnessed this before, that there are resources being put in place. We can talk then later on in the next question, how sustainable are these, right? That's another part of it we can unpack. That's not a question now. I just wanted to add to the national level in Canada as a nation state. What are some of the things that we're seeing on the ground? And we know there's certainly room for improvement, but we have seen some shifts in resource, in capacity building for Black community organizations. Locally, for myself as a Black organization, started off by immigrant Blacks who came here in the 50s. We have a building, we bought our own building, and we were able to receive some resources to do some infrastructure improvements, and there are many others. So, with all these warts and pimples, we have seen some island of success. There are some issues that we are very encouraged by. We can talk later on about some other things that we're not so encouraged by. And that one is, how do we sustain this momentum? Is it just one-offs? And how do we make sure that we do not go back to the past, but certainly look to building a more sustainable future, building their capacity to drive change, and to make sure that Black community voices are captured in policies and in program design and development. So there's a long way to go, but we have seen some shifts, and I really want to give a shout out to the people who are across Canada who are running the supporting Black community initiatives from coast to coast to coast, and they're having some impact across the community. So I'll just stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you touched on a lot of things. I think we're all encouraged by the amount of Black-led organizations that are supporting Black Canadians across the country. I know a lot of hard work is happening on that front, but also the fact that resources are showing up. But the question is always going to be, is this a momentary thing, or are we going, I think it's up to us to seize the moment and see how we can leverage where we're at in the moment. So thanks, Evelyn. I appreciate all of your thoughts. Lloydine, I'm going to pass it over to you, representing Toronto. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the same question. And let me reiterate for you, just in case you've lost it. We're really just focusing on the achievements that have happened up until now and some potential future milestones. What are we expecting to see?
Thank you very much. And assuming with protocol has already been established, and that I'm assuming that I have permission from elders on this call to speak, I will continue. So I'm going to try to frame my responses within the 3 pillars of the decade. So that's recognition, justice, and development. Both my Evelyn and Ms. Curry spoke about them, but I want to talk about the accomplishment. So Evelyn made reference to the Supporting Black Canadian Community Initiatives. That's a $200 million investment. The Black-led Philanthropic Fund is also $200 million. The Black Entrepreneurship Fund is 265 million over 4 years. And Mental Health for Black Canadians Fund is 10 million. Then there's the Multicultural and Anti-Racism Program that has been funded. We're talking about the Black Justice Strategy, which falls under that particular pillar. In terms of recognition, there's been at least about 40 Canadians that have been recognized, or places or events that have been recognized in an attempt to advance Canada's attempt to bring us to the forefront and recognize us as citizens in this country. That includes Emancipation Day. It includes the recognition of the transatlantic slave trade and the enslavement of African peoples. I say to people all the time, notwithstanding all of these accomplishments, and also in education, because in Ontario, through the school boards, we have, Evelyn spoke about the Black history that's going to be included in the curriculum. And we also have the Center for Black Excellence here in Toronto, under the Toronto District School Board. But I also think it's about managing our expectations in terms of where we are, as the experience of people of African ancestry who've been enslaved in this country. That wasn't that long ago. And so while we look at these accomplishments, we see them more as foundational in terms of getting to starting that place, and also building of capacity and bridging of capacity in Black communities across Canada, as diverse as we are. So in terms of the future, in terms of your question about the future, thinking about things like a greater investment around the mental health status of Blacks in this country, because mental distress is a very real thing. We recognize that the issues are becoming far more complex, and also in terms of a larger investment, looking at this as more of a holistic approach to working with our communities, and more integration and interconnectedness between the different departments within the government and even in our communities. So conversations should be had not just with the mental health folks or with the business folks or with the justice folks, but all of it together, because we are a whole people. And therefore, the way in which we want to address our concerns should come from that holistic perspective. I think also in terms of what we hope for the future is the recognition that cultural identity is centered around our past, present, and future. So that when we look at the approach to the work, so you raise the point of whether it's temporary or more sustainable. The sustainability comes also from us defining and naming for ourselves what is important for us. So we also, as persons of African ancestry, do need to be intentional about our collaborations and our priorities going forward, and also leading some of the issues that we are most affected by, and so that we can own much more than we have and leverage our voices to be recognized in such a way that politicians become concerned more about the Black vote, because the Black vote carries something. So I think that's what I would say in terms of where we would hope to go through the future, but also acknowledging we have the Hamilton Declaration that came out of the summit hosted by the Michael Jean Foundation. And out of that declaration speaks to many things that were identified in 2017 when the expert working group came to Canada. I was involved in that process in terms of submissions, and although we have accomplished a lot, we're hoping that the future allows us to see that Canada has addressed the over 40 recommendations that came out of that report by the working group, and in particular around those that are also co-located with human rights of African peoples in this country. I'm complete. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Flordine. One thing I admire most about you is you are up to date and very precise. The fact that you were able to tell us all of the accomplishments that we've been able to see up until now to the dollar point, I think really helps our audience put things in perspective. I don't think that this is something we have seen in, I mean, at least in my in my lifetime. And so thank you for always, you know, bringing that perspective to the table. I think there's a lot to look at. I want to move on to the second question, which really is just around the fact that Canada has decided to extend this to this decade to 2028. What do you think that means for us? Should we advocate for another decade? And if so, how can we build on the accomplishments that we've had thus far that you guys have all spoken about quite in depth? Do we set new objectives, or do we further advance the goals that have already been set out? I'll start with you, Evelyn.
Yeah, I think we must acknowledge that the pernicious nature of racism, and it will take, it's over 400 years. It's not going to take a decade to eliminate racial discrimination, anti-Black racism. So I think it's important that we look to extending the decade. In the meantime, we could, as Claudine mentioned, the whole idea of this being foundational, it's almost like a benchmarking exercise that we have actually, for the first time, many generations before us have fought for support for community development, for support for all the issues we talked about earlier. And this is the first time we have seen any big allocation of resources in our country for Black people. So to me, that's like a benchmarking. So we're starting here. As mentioned earlier about statutory justice, you know, we do have the issue to address here in Canada. The Black Nova Scotians who came from Jamaica, the Maroons, who then were taken and sent to Sierra Leone. So we do have a case to be made for slavery in Canada and for reparations. So to have this as a foundational piece is a good start, and certainly to look at the recommendations, make sure that they're being addressed. The issue of justice, for example, the Justice Report, Canada Justice Strategist was released not too long ago, and we need to make sure those recommendations are addressed and that they come to life. The overrepresentation of Black bodies in the prison system is unacceptable. So we cannot just extend adding more to it. We need to make sure that whatever it is that we have articulated, that we are addressing. And the whole area of mental health issue, the whole issue of criminal justice system, the school to prison pipeline is real. It's not an American phenomenon. It's happening here in Canada, all across the country. So we need to address those. So I'd say we need to extend the decade. And I'm glad the Prime Minister decided to acknowledge that they were 3 years late. And so they're going to actually make it a 10-year commitment as opposed to a 7-year commitment. And I know that many countries across the Caribbean and other Black nation states have been pushing for an extension of the decade. And I think my colleague here, Yanel, will probably speak more deeply on that within the context of the global nation states. But in Canada, definitely we want to add our voice to that call. I know Jamaica not too long ago, the UN pushed for extension of this date. And I think there is so much more to be done. We're just starting to address issues of anti-Black racism in Canada. So, you know, if we're going to make change, if we're going to make it sustainable and shift systems and policies and create a new and a better way, we have to extend the decade, and also add more resources and build more capacity to drive that change. So I'd like to hear a bit more from my sister Gaynell, who has a much broader context beyond Canada. But yeah, we should in fact look at that as we have young people, youth. More efforts have to be spent with addressing issues of youth in our community, building their capacity, empowering them, building civil society to really be agents of change across across our country. So I'm really looking forward to more and more countries pushing for an extension of the decade. So I'll stop with that right now, and I'll ask my other colleagues to expand on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Evelyn. I think we'll move on to Galen. Same question. We're extending to 2028. Should we extend for another decade? And how can we build on past accomplishments and look, or are we creating new objectives?
Thank you. And yes, it's such a wonderful opportunity for me to be here and to learn about what Canada is doing. It's always such a pleasure to hear the success that is being made. There's always, of course, room for improvement, but we at the forum and myself commend the work being done so far. And I think what I like about what I'm hearing is that the money is being placed for real commitments and change. So I commend the Canadian government's decision to support the implementation of a second decade. And as I understood, the allocation of funding is going to be crucial, and that seems to be there. That is a wonderful step in the right direction. We would encourage other states, of course, to similarly support and commit financially to a second decade. One of the challenges that we have found in the first decade was the issue of funding. And I know while I worked in the UN, that has been a challenge for us to get the adequate funding. And at regional level, and now with the forum, we recognize the issue of funding being a great impediment in terms of the work that we do. And I would just, I would add this in because I feel obliged to, the Secretariat of the Permanent Forum is grossly underfunded. And we have one staff, essentially, and we are 10 experts working to implement a vast agenda. And there's so much that we would love to be doing that we are not able to do because of the limitation of funding. We, in effect, can meet according to our mandate once a year for 4 days. And this really boils down for our entire term that we would have met 12 days. Given the importance of this agenda to us, and I think to the global community, this is unacceptable. One staff, 1 day a year for 3 years for 4 days. It's not enough. So I'll add that. So I'm so happy to hear that you have some funding to do something in Canada for Black people. This is crucial. So we want states to really put their money where their mouth is, because other than that, it just becomes what we do not want the forum to be. And we're working hard to ensure that it's not that, just a talk shop. What can we really do to bring about some change? We provide that forum for people of African descent to come to us, to engage with us, to participate with us. And what we have found ourselves doing and being forced to do is to go out to communities and to engage and to participate and to hear from Black people, to understand what the realities are in their particular settings, and to try to see how we can bring that back to our forum to bring about some concrete change at the global level. We're pushing on certain key issues, as I mentioned already. For us, we are calling for a second decade, and we have indicated that in our recent report that we will be calling for a second decade. We have been meeting. Our former chair and soon to be appointed chair, June Suma, has been speaking about this issue quite extensively, that we need this to complement also the work that we're doing in the forum, to also complement the elaboration of a declaration on the rights of people of African descent. As was just said by my esteemed colleague on the panel, we had 400 years of slavery and colonialism. Why are we haggling about an additional 10 years? So for us, the 10 years on the forum, we would want it to be leaning toward reparatory justice, as I mentioned. This is crucial to us. Of course, recognition and equity, addressing systemic and structural racial discrimination at the local, national, regional, and global levels. It has to happen at all levels for there to be real change. as a former staff member, when I was at the UN, I pushed for this. I need to see more faces like my own around the table, bringing about change for people of African descent. It is crucial. Representation is key. We would call for, in order for there to be success, without a doubt, there has to be the adequate funding and political commitment. Moving toward a second decade, we would look for a more inclusive framework that we can work with. We know that the second decade would lead us into 2034. This is right about the rounding up of the Sustainable Development Goals. How can we work with with this framework, which regrettably does not include Black people in the framework? How can we work with this? How can we shape it? How can we change it with the decade to say that what is this sustainable development about if it is not for us? Why are we not a part of it and strategically a part of it? And how can we bring in this second decade the intersections that are important to us? And some of it has been mentioned already, the issue of women and women's health, the issue of trauma and intergenerational trauma. How do we address that? How do we address maternal health for women? Why are more Black women dying in larger numbers in childbirth? So these are some of the issues that we've been talking about, the issue of education. And I will add that Black women, certainly in the Caribbean, have been doing very well with respect to education, and we graduate at higher rates than boys. Girls graduate with higher numbers than boys in high school and tertiary levels as well. The University of the Bahamas, certainly we have about 70% female graduates. Significant of those, the vast majority of those are Black women. The issue for us in terms of education is we have to develop the whole country. So we have to ensure that our boys are equally educated, that they're not pulled on the side, that they're not pulled into the prison pipeline, that they're not pulled into gangs and other adverse activities, that they are actively involved as partners with women in development of these countries, in development of all societies where Black people live. We fundamentally believe that the second decade will help us step more clearly and definitively into where we see Black people going, how we can manage that. The Permanent Forum is an excellent partner in this process, partnering with Canada, of course, and with all other states and civil society especially, to make this happen for Black people. We're committed, and we would love to see that same political commitment and commitment financially at all levels globally. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm wanting to be sure of the time. I think a lot of there's so much to share, and I wish we had like 5 hours. But I'm going to turn it over to Floydine. The floor is yours around the decade. And then I'm going to move on to our final question and ask for each of the panelists to briefly touch on that. But to reiterate the question for you, Floydine, we're just talking about, now that the decade has been extended, should we advocate for another decade? And how can we look at our past achievements, or are we creating new objectives moving forward?
Thank you. I think to answer that question, we all have to understand what we will be solving for by adding another decade. I think that's the question, because as it stands now, the extension of the decade, this decade in Canada for 3 years, perhaps allows the issuing of an apology for African Canadians and to consider reparations. It allows for the consideration of legally recognizing African Canadians as a distinct group. It also allows for more work on gender equality and equity. It also allows for addressing the mental health crisis that is being faced in this country by African Canadians. So all that to say that there's still outstanding work to be done based on the recommendations of the UN expert working group. So extending the decade would allow for some push to ensure some more of those recommendations are acknowledged and implemented. But I think I'll go back to my beginning by saying it's really important to understand that while we have, the Prime Minister has extended the decade, it allows the opportunity to complete some of the things that exists, and then adding a new decade would really make sense if we're understanding what we are solving for, in terms of the economic pieces, the political pieces, the cultural pieces, all of those things. Because without understanding and knowing that and having a unified voice around it here in this country, it just becomes another 10 years. And I think it also allows for us to consider looking at a scorecard, right, for this country on what its accomplishments are, and also a balance between what people understand, because the reality is many people still don't know that this decade exists. So it also allows for the 3 years to spend to do some more promotion about the decade and get more engagement of citizens in this country across the lifespan. So starting with our young ones, all the way up to our elders who carry the wisdom and the knowledge. I'm complete. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Floydine. And for the final question, I mean, we likely want to discuss, where the ongoing challenge is. So identifying just briefly, if each of you can very briefly speak to the challenges that people of African descent are facing in Canada, around the world, particularly in the context of economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights. So I know that, Ms. Curry just spoke about what that looks like in Bermuda and what the forum's plans are. But what do you think the challenges of people of African descent are around economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights and their achievements?
I could start then. So I think economic inequality still persists in this country. We know the Black communities experience disproportionate levels of poverty, unemployment, and income inequality that continues. We also know that social justice or social injustice is a real problem for our community. African descended people face systemic racism and discrimination in various spheres of life, including healthcare. We talked about that, education, housing, and the criminal justice system. So all the things we've talked about, we are saying that there's some action that started to take place. We haven't said that it's being solved. We have also said that the government of Canada, for the first time, has been identifying some of those issues and adding resources, to start to militate against them, certainly. But we also know that there are policies that needs to be changed. And we also know that the voice of the Black community to be embedded in decision making. So representation is critical. Representation matters. So social injustice around housing, we see the homelessness crisis in Canada and across the world is happening, and is certainly very evident, not only at the global level, but also in Hamilton, Ontario, just where I live.
Right next door.
Exactly. We know that environmental injustice, Black communities around the world, and Ms. Gaynell just spoke about that, the climate issues of the Caribbean, and our esteemed Prime Minister of the Caribbean, Ms. Barbados Prime Minister, has talked a lot about these issues globally. Moxley. And certainly it's a huge concern that we have to be careful about addressing issues of environmental hazard. It's affect Black people globally. So I think that we have a lot of issues still to address. I would like to really promote the idea again, or to add to the idea of reparatory justice. I believe globally that reparations needs to be paid out. When those people who were enslaving African people got paid, when they lose their chattels at the time, they cleaned out the coffers of Haiti and Jamaica and all the other Caribbean countries. That is why we had to seek a place to come and live so that we can have a better economic life. We have to leave our Caribbean nations and to come to Canada because of the fact that our families couldn't find work. Our economy was destroyed because we used our wealth, or our wealth was stolen to build other countries. So it's only just that that is acknowledged and compensation is paid for the travesty of enslavement of African peoples and the fact that we were deemed non-human and simply property. We cannot forget that. We cannot move forward if we're not addressing those foundational issues. Root cause analysis, it needs to be addressed, and our ancestors expect us to drive that message home, and we will continue to. If it's me or my grandchildren or great-grandchildren, it is not something we're going to give up on.
Thank you, Evelyn. Gaynell, you had spoken about this in the Bahamas and what already in the last question, and so I'm hoping you can briefly touch on this.
Yeah, just to briefly reiterate, what happened in the Caribbean in the past few years, of course, the pandemic, but I would say hurricanes, the impact of, for us in the Bahamas, for example, Dorian, has really highlighted the issues around poverty and economic inequalities around the unemployment issues, around the need to broaden the economic base of the country, the need to address our health systems almost collapsed. They were very near to collapse. And so these inequalities need to be desperately addressed. So identifying and my sister who mentioned the point is what is to be gained with the second decade. That's an important question, it's a very crucial question. We're not asking for a second decade to have a second decade. What we hope to accomplish in that decade must be clearly defined. And certainly I'll speak from the position of the forum. We have indicated what we want to see in that decade. And we want to see a focus on reparatory justice, a focus on addressing systemic and structural racism. And for me, the issues around justice broadly, as I mentioned, economic justice, climate justice, reparatory justice, this has to be the focus for us. Certainly I'm speaking for us in the forum, but also for us in the Caribbean, where these issues are very important. Reparations, there's a pushback on reparations saying that, oh, we're not sure about how we will pay that, how we will fund that, what it would look like. Maybe these are issues we ought not be thinking about. That was in the past, whatever. But the reality is, and I remind my students all the time, this is not old news, because the UK completed its payment to the plantation owners in 2015. 2015 was the last payment made to those persons that owned our ancestors, essentially. So this is current day issues. These are issues that need to be addressed. If we are talking about reimbursing those persons that enslaved us up to 2015, hundreds of years later, we need to be thinking strategically about what can we do to ensure reparations moving forward for the descendants of slaves. And I'll mention the 2003 Brethel Group report, which quantified the reparations that owed for the transatlantic slave trade, owed by European states for the transatlantic slave trade. We cannot forget, we cannot allow this next decade to go without ensuring that reparations remain at the forefront of everybody's mind. And I want to reiterate the issue around Haiti. Haiti, for us, is the North Star on reparations. We cannot speak about reparations unless we speak about Haiti. I mean, what has happened in that country is clear. What has happened to Black people, Black countries, is clear. In this region, we need to have a discussion around that. And how do we, it's a tough conversation, of course, but it's one that needs to be had. And the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, we're ready to have that conversation with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. I think you touch on so many important points, and we really cannot let it go. We cannot stop the conversation around reparations because it is what is due to us and our ancestors, particularly if we're paying out folks who had enslaved us for their inconvenience of enslaving us. It really cannot go unanswered. So the last word is yours, Floydine.
$675 million is what has been invested to date. to Black Canadians. Interestingly enough, of that 675 million, while it's impressive in terms of a start, it's not sustainable money. Once that money ends, it ends, and that creates another level of threat. When we speak about reparations and you think about the 675 million, think of the value of the human lives of persons of African ancestry, which is probably well beyond that 675 million. I think also in terms of threats, and Ms. Curry spoke about IAT, the consequence, if you will, from my perspective, of having taken your independence and the outcome of, and feeling that even to this day, and the deplorable situation that exists in Haiti, as well as other parts of the world, while we're focusing on certain parts and not really paying attention to what's happening on the continent, and as well as what's happening in other places where diasporic Africans are. So I think all of this in terms of reparations and the mental health and the mental distress piece means that we have less people able to function as well as we're capable of. So I think those are the pieces for me on where I sit on my work life and in my personal life and community life continue to happen. And also in terms of just sustaining some things, because it's one thing to give the funding, but the idea of something that says that we exist, I mean, it makes a big difference. And so that's where I will conclude. But I just want people to leave with that number, $675 million. And the value of that over 400 years of the enslavement of African people in this country, where people in this country left Canada and went back to the US because of their experiences here. And 675 million is all I want to say in terms of the investment. And if there's that much money, there's obviously more. And so I'm complete. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Those were so insightful. I feel like I have learned from all of you. Floydine with like the precise numbers and from a Canadian context, I really, really appreciate that. Evelyn, you being able to speak on so many things that are happening locally for us, but also having a global lens. And Gaynell, I really cannot thank you enough for bringing the international perspective from the Caribbean, being able to speak on behalf of the islands and the challenges that you're facing, really adds the global perspective and how what I'm really taking away from the discussion that you shared was really around the intersectionality, and it's how it's not the normal North American conversation around intersectionality, but how, you know, environment and economics all collide together, and how these are all places that we need to be seeking justice, in particular with reparations, and really ensuring that our people are heard on that. Well, we won't let it ever go. So that being said, people have been listening very intently, and so I'm going to move over to some questions from the audience. I want to make sure that these are that we're answering at least a few of these questions, and so if we could just keep the answers brief, or maybe one person can grab each of these questions. So if you could envision a person in your role in 30 years from now, what kinds of challenges and goals would you like to see the person working on, building on your contributions today? I'm actually going to hand this over to Gaynell, if that's okay, because I'm interested to hear what your perspective is on this question.
Working in this space at the international level is very interesting, because I've been working at the global level for 24 years, thereabouts. And it's difficult to see yourself around the table. And in the future, what I want to see is more representation of me at the table, more representation of issues that are important to me, not not issues of Black people and people from small island developing states coming to fit into what exists and what existed from the colonial period. I'd want to see a system that represents us, that we have shaped, that we have had a part in creating, and not just a system, us being part of a system that they created for us and said, okay, you can sit at the table for one or two of you for a while. We want a system that represents us. We want to see the global economic institutions representing us. We want a seat more consistently around those tables that represents Black people. When we're at the table and we get to set the agenda, we don't have the issue where we're constantly chasing our tails, where we're bouncing back from a hurricane, bouncing back from a COVID, trying to seek international support and being told, hey, you're going to be blacklisted because you're not acting the way the European countries think you should be acting. Because who creates the blacklist? So on top of all of this, you create the injustice. You do not give us an opportunity to help get over that injustice. And you say, yes, I will allow you to help yourselves. I can give you a loan with high interest rates. We need to be at the table determining why are we there? Why are we not there determining who should be blacklisted and who is and is not blacklisted? And why is there a black list that we in the Caribbean are consistently on for trying repeatedly because at the time of emancipation, we got nothing but freedom. That's it. You get your freedom and you move on. You develop yourselves the best way you can. You borrow, you try to make it happen. I want to see in the future a system, a global system that is one that we have helped to shape, that we have shaped, that we have determined, that we are sitting around and deciding what next for us. I want to see more of me at the table and more of what is important to the Caribbean at the table.
I love that, Gaynell. I think as you were speaking, the contrast that I really had was oftentimes in lower income communities, you see the money marts and the high interest pay loans and kind of the perpetual, seeking of folks trying to, the word is losing me, but when our communities are constantly being put into a corner where we're borrowing at high interest rates and how that is happening, predatory lending, there we go, predatory lending,
There we go.
in our communities is also happening at an international level. And so thank you for that, and kind of contrasting that for me. I'm going to pass this one over to Evelyn, which is around intersectionality. We very briefly just touched on this. And so how do you as activists and human rights experts advocate for the rights of Black communities broadly while taking into account the diverse intersectionality embedded in community based upon gender, sexuality, immigration status, disability, and other factors?
I think I'm going to flip the question and say we should be embracing and embedding an intersectional approach to this work. We cannot do it piecemeal or in a siloed fashion. One of the ways we can do this work is to collaborate, to bring voices, diverse voices, the diversity of Blackness to the table, so we can at least develop a planned and a collective agenda to address all these intersectionalities. It's a critical piece of work that needs to happen. If we do not embed an intersectional approach, we will be going back to the table time after time with pieces of work and pieces of in a siloed manner. And people will get fatigued and frustrated. And at the end of the day, we will have lost the battle or the war. So the point is that we need to embed an intersectional lens, a framework, and approach to this work. It cannot be done in a piecemeal way.
Yeah, I love that, Evelyn. I think it also speaks to the diversity of the Black community. We often are thinking about it from one perspective, but there's folks in the Caribbean, there's people in South America. Like, we really have to, yes, what brings us all together is our Black identity, but that looks and is celebrated in so many different ways. I'm going to pass it. This is almost like it was made for Floydine, because it really is around education. So what role does education sector have in the fight against anti-racism? And should we be looking at advocating for change in the curriculum?
I think education plays an important role, but not just in the system. The destruction of a nation begins at home. And so when we start to educate from home, and then that is taken into communities, and then the system itself starts to recognize, when children are able to see themselves represented in content and factually, not with, the symbols and all of those that we see on people's lawns in certain places, but genuinely represented, to see themselves and say, I can become that too. Because our lives are beyond sports, it's beyond basketball and football and track and field and all of those things. We come from a history of scientists and medicine and brilliant community builders. So I think the role of education is to take leadership on ensuring, right, that the fight from our communities is not so arduous, that this is not a fight, it's a right. And so I think that's the role in this country. Education is at the provincial level, but I think there needs to be more engagement both at municipal and federal levels to ensure that content is there and people don't have to be going and relying on Dr. Google for information that may not be accurate and so on, but bring more representation, like Ms. Curry said, more representation in the classrooms and leadership in a way to understand that the role of education includes bringing drumming and movement and spoken word and centering them as part of the learning experience. And I say that primarily because our existence, our survival, and our healing are grounded in these things. And the sharing of knowledge and understanding that is important. So I think finally the education piece is to expand what the understanding of education really is in a way that it engages all of our children, because research has shown us that many of the children who are being diagnosed with ADHD and ADD and all those Ds is because the system is built on a particular approach that does not match the realities around how our melanated children learn. And so then what happens is they end up in conflict. So I think it's all of that. This is a whole nother webinar, Gabby. And I just want to say that there needs to be an expansion in the thinking and creating a different box. And perhaps it's not even a box, but instead of trying to fit us into a box that we were not carved to be in the first place. I'm complete. Thank you.
I knew that would fuel something in you. I think that you are an educator to our entire community. I want to say thank you so much. Honestly, this is an honor and a privilege. I want to thank all of you for your time, your effort, but more importantly, for your contributions to our community. I think that as this goes out, people will be able to see and hear from each of you. And I know as a member of this community that each and every one of you have played a tremendous role in building us up. I know I'm here on your backs. So this has really been a privilege to be able to hear from all of you. I think for all of you in the audience, I think we all can agree that we have been educated, we have learned, we have maybe been emotional at times. I know I've been like, yes, we're never going to let it go. However, I think that most importantly, I think that we have all heard, and I think we have some tangible things that we need to address, and hopefully you have been able to assess for yourselves and reflected on how you can contribute as we continue the decade. I think more importantly, we're walking away understanding whether this is extended or not, we march on and we continue. Our decade is going to continue to be until our last breath is taken, and we become ancestors. So the decade will never end for us. And I am so grateful that you all are here to continue to march on with us. Thank you all for joining. Thank you. A
Thank
special
you.
thank you to the Amnesty staff who put this together, and to all of the membership who showed up. We would be talking to ourselves if you didn't show. So thank you for your commitment to human rights. And on behalf of the entire Amnesty Canada English speaking section, we thank you and we hope that you have a tremendous good night.